The Honourable Member Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Chair. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Kia ora. It's a privilege to rise and take a call on part one of the maritime legislation bill in front of this House. First up, I'd like to thank all the select committee members, the submitters. In part one, I'm going to take a pretty short call. It's part two that I'm very interested in exploring in depth. Part one's pretty non-controversial, and all it does is support harbour navigational safety upgrades, acceding to some international conventions, clarifying some miscellaneous amendments, and it's those implementing international conventions contained in part one, which is the substance of my call. Mr Speaker, it was the Rena catastrophe more than almost 2 years ago. There was a wake-up call for New Zealand and should have been a wake-up call for the government, but it's clear the lessons of the Rena still aren't being learnt by this government. What we know from the Rena catastrophe is the New Zealand taxpayer had to come to the party to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, more than $100 million, because successive governments hadn't signed up or updated our legislation to protect the taxpayer. I think it's a shame. This money could have been spent on better things like breakfast for kids in schools or supporting Kiwi businesses, creating jobs. And I think I point to the Labour Party, of course, as those in greenhouses, those in glass houses shouldn't be throwing stones. And what we know from the Labour government is, like the National government, they dragged their heels. They didn't sign up and ratify these conventions, despite successive governments signalling internationally they wanted to. So the three international conventions on the subject of the floor of Parliament today is the Protocol of 1996, Convention to amend limitation of liability for maritime claims 1976, the LLMC, and all this does is update the limit for liability when ships have accidents at sea from $11.2 to $27 million. Hopefully an Australian proposal to extend that further will gain international traction. But again, we know the Rena, I think it's the third most expensive maritime disaster this century, possibly of all time. Still was much, much greater than the $27 million maximum cap under the LLMC. Secondly, you've got the International Convention on Civil Liability for Bunker Oil Pollution Damage, and then lastly, the protocol relating to intervention on the high seas in cases of pollution by substances other than oil, which extends powers in the Maritime Transport Act. So three common sense legislative upgrades, ratifying international treaties that all parties in Parliament support. I agree with the Labour Party, we should have done this years ago and the taxpayer wouldn't be in the hock for tens of millions of dollars with the Rena. Likewise, what we should have seen is there are penalties with the maximum corporate rate under the resource management upgraded. The maximum penalty is only $600,000 and the government's not taken the opportunity of this legislation or further legislative actions to actually upgrade that. $600,000 is laughable when we've seen the taxpayer have to pay tens of millions of dollars. And while we're at it, protecting our Kiwi environment and protecting the taxpayer, we could have been upgrading our oil spill response capability. We could have been building up the Oil Pollution Fund. We could have been listening to business and union and purchasing a rapid response multi-purpose vessel. We could have had a truly independent inquiry into the Rena, not a stitch-up from the government benches getting a Prime Minister's mate to do an in-house job, which I'm sure is just going to find everything was hunky-dory. But what we know from the Rena was it's a case study in not how to deal with a spill, how not to communicate with the public, how to alienate the public when it comes to volunteers literally going down to the beaches, picking up the oil blobs themselves because there was no one from Maritime New Zealand to tell them what to do. Through to learning the lessons, which this government fails to learn the lessons to protect the environment, protects the taxpayer. All in all, Mr Speaker, the Greens will be supporting the measures in part one, but we should have learnt these lessons an awful long time ago.
Mr Chairman.
I call the Honourable Member Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr